Good afternoon, this is Carrie Morris, and I'd like to talk with you about Aristotle's rhetoric. I've entitled the presentation 3 by 3. You may be familiar with this concept of 3. We're very fond of it in the Western world. We divide many things into 3. Most of you have written a 5-paragraph theme, and in those you have an introduction, you make 3 points, and then you summarize what you've done. This is a concept that seems to really have dominated in the West. And one of the things that I'd like us to think about is that it could be the case that the notion of dividing things into 3s has worth or meaning. It actually may have something to do with the way reality works. On the other hand, it may be arbitrary. It may be something that is culturally significant, but not significant past that environment. Aristotle has a huge impact in shaping the way we organize the world. Most of his work and most of his life was devoted to just this, talking about what are individual things, what is this, what is that, and of taking that entity and organizing it and putting it into categories. He creates a lot of heuristics or templates for us to think about the world. The rhetoric is no different. Before we look at how he divides up the rhetoric, I want us to first think about what sort of worldview this comes from. So today we're going to be looking at the concept of 3 big areas of importance for Aristotle, and underneath each of those there will be 3 different versions of it so that you can get an idea of how this works. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is epistemology, and this is our theory of knowledge or how the world works. So Aristotle takes the view of all knowledge that we have and he divides it into 3 kinds. Again, I think you can see from the initial notion that he's working from that these are relatively arbitrary sorts of categories, but they help us really understand how he's thinking. So we have 3 categories: the theoretical, the practical, and the productive. Theoretical knowledge is disinterested study of first principles and ends and what cannot be otherwise. Examples of this are philosophy, mathematics, and natural science. Now, disinterested is going to be unbiased, and first principles will be the building blocks, the major things that we can know to be true. What we want to get from theoretical knowledge is the notion of the capital T truth. That is, these are things that are true about how the world works, and they can't be otherwise. Once we've established these, we can't debate them or argue about them. These are static and firm, and they shape everything. The most important thing to know about theoretical knowledge is that it's the highest on the hierarchy. It is the most important thing. He devotes most of his canon to talking about philosophy, mathematics, and natural science. So these are the things that very much matter to him. He only gives a nod to some of the others. The second is practical knowledge. Now, practical knowledge is the kind whose end, or its telos, is in the good life or in happiness. And his examples here are ethics and politics. So the knowledge that we produce in ethics and politics has to produce ways of living in certain ways. So in politics, for instance, one of the documents that practical knowledge produces is a constitution. Aristotle has several pieces that he writes about ethics and how things work, and within these texts, he has some understanding of context and culture. He has some idea that these principles are not necessarily fixed and static, that they can be shaped in different ways. Again, keeping in mind that he has an audience of a lot of Athenians. He is not originally from Athens, so as a traveler, he's probably more aware than others that some of these things are different from culture to culture, and that perhaps not one culture has the only answer or the right answer. In general, though, this is knowledge that tells us how to live how to live well, and politics, how to govern well. The third type, and the lowest down in terms of the ranking, is productive knowledge. And productive knowledge doesn't have an end in itself, but rather in the user. And he considers all of the arts part of productive knowledge. And it's interesting, I think, for us to see what is an art. So medicine is in there, poetics, and rhetoric. Now, some say rhetoric can fit in the practical knowledge section, and we can talk about that in class. I think it works a little bit better in the productive knowledge category. But this end of knowledge for productive knowledge is in the receiver, in the audience. And this is a really important aspect of the rhetoric, and for that matter of poetics and the medicine. He really is able to understand that it is what the audience does in response to this use of knowledge rather than the knowledge itself. I think medicine is the most helpful example because it reveals a lot of the principles of rhetoric that become very important for Aristotle and for others in understanding rhetoric. So in medicine, we can study certain things that are true or that we know from the natural sciences. But when we apply those things to a patient, context and situation matter greatly. So not so much cultural knowledge, although that has something to do with it, but also individuals. So we're not looking at culture and broad differences. Rather, we're looking at very specific differences in individuals. So we've got to be responsive to those. And so this notion of kairos originates, or one of its early uses is in medicine. Well, rhetoric and poetics can be understood then in that sense. It gives us an understanding. Also, the notion that we have today of practicing medicine, I think, is given some dimension by seeing where it exists. Okay, now, within rhetoric, which falls under productive knowledge, we have three proofs, three ways of going about artistically. He has artistic proofs and inartistic proofs. And the artistic proofs are the ones he cares the most about. They are the ones that we have control over. And he says that there are three of them: ethos, pathos, and logos. Now, I want to say one brief word about pronunciation, and that is that the Greek language way of saying these is ethos, pathos, and logos. However, it's perfectly acceptable to say ethos, logos, and pathos. So how you pronounce it is really variable depending on the group that you're in. It follows most pronunciation situations. So the three proofs are the available means for Aristotle. The first one I'm going to talk about is ethos, and that is the character and credibility in the speaker. Now, notice that while ethos is centered in the speaker, Aristotle's very interested in ethos as an artistic means. That is something that is created. That's in contrast to something that is true outside of the speech. So he's going to contrast the lived experience of the speaker with the way in which the speaker presents that set of values in the speech itself. Isocrates, one of his competitors or fellow teachers in the era, will make the argument that the argument of a man's life is the most important thing that a man can bring to his speech. Aristotle's looking at this slightly differently. And the main point, I think, for him is that if rhetoric is an art, then we have to only talk about things within this that we can have artistic control over. He talks about plenty of inartistic means, testimony, other sorts of factual witness testimony, and so on. But he's talking about what we can create, what we can build and make in the process. So ethos is how we demonstrate our character for listeners. Now, one of the things I think it's very important to understand about ethos is that thing that we value as an audience about speakers is going to vary depending on what culture or group that we're in. There may be some groups that value lots of knowledge. So let's take academics. So heavily cited materials, very carefully argued, scientific evidence, that might be more valued among academics. Whereas personal experience might be more valued if you're talking about parenting. You want to know what someone has done. How have you handled sleep problems? And in that case, you're going to have the personal experience. So those values that we have, that is, I've lived in a certain way, or I can prove, in this certain way. These kinds of things that we contribute are going to have a lot to do with how character and credibility are demonstrated. So whatever the group values in terms of character is how we're going to be required to develop our perception of character. Pathos is the use of emotion. And that is emotion used to create in the audience a sense of availability and willingness to hear. Most of us, and certainly the Greeks, have some concerns about emotion. We tend to, particularly within rational and academic environments, think of emotions as things that take us away from rationality, that may even, in the way that Gorgias talks about, bewitch us, trick us into doing certain things. Aristotle has concerns about emotion that he inherits from his culture and also from his teacher, Plato. However, Aristotle is the first one to come along, in writing anyway, to kind of understand the psychology of the listener and the speaker. And he understands emotion as a sort of catalyst in the audience to be able to get them to hear and to be willing to act in certain ways. One of my favorite sections in the rhetoric, or one of my favorite emotions that he talks about, is the notion of fear. And he says that fear makes us willing to deliberate. But then he says too much fear prevents us from deliberating. So for Aristotle, emotion is all about amount and balance. And he says that if we can establish fear in the audience, we can make them aware and open to the possibility that we need to debate a situation. So if you have a culture that really values civil rights in various ways, and let's say our First Amendment rights, we can speak about whatever we want, whenever we want. We tend to not be open to deliberation about that unless we feel that there is something that can be harmed, unless we feel afraid of something in some way. And if we do feel afraid, then we are more willing to deliberate the possibility of limiting that freedom. So let's say we want to hear about views and opinions that are contrary to democracies. We typically have a fairly high tolerance for those in our culture. However, if we're in a time of war, we might consider that kind of use of language and emotion as treachery, as doing treasonous sorts of things. And we're able to be interested in that because we're afraid. However, Aristotle warns us that if we become too afraid, then we are much more likely to simply run away and to be unwilling to deal with things. I've read several critiques of the environmental movement saying that environmentalists and global warming folks have used too much fear in their discussion of some of the issues, and that has left audiences feeling completely immobilized. And I think Aristotle understands this and how it works. Logos is the argument itself. Now, most of his text, the rhetoric, is devoted to logos. The least is devoted to ethos, and the least is devoted to pathos, and then you also have ethos. So logos is the most important. We would say it's the jewel in the crown for him. I'm not going to go in depth about all the many terms because he has dozens of them. Most of the key concepts come from logos. But I do want to illustrate one, which is enthymeme, because enthymeme is a strategy for argumentation that he uses to parallel with dialectic. He considers dialectic a method. It is the way we understand theoretical knowledge. Dialectic is the method for theoretical knowledge. We go through a process of question and answer and then are able to isolate what we want to say. In rhetoric, the method, for practical knowledge, rhetoric is the method. For civic life, rhetoric is the method. And its form is not dialectic, but enthymeme. The dialectic has the form of syllogism, and rhetoric has the form of enthymeme. Now, an enthymeme is basically a logical form that is made so that a lay audience or a general audience can understand it, whereas syllogism is a very technical sort of argument scheme. And he delineates those two because everyone in the civic world should be able to have access to argument, whereas he thinks only philosophers and very wise should have a role in epistemology, so we can have more sophisticated standards. We'll talk about a lot more terms for that. Now, the third of the threes that I'm going to talk about are the kinds or genres that Aristotle has in the rhetoric, and he cites three kinds: deliberative, judicial, and epidictic. Each of the three have a time period devoted to it. So deliberative is future, judicial is past, and epidictic is present. Deliberative, again, emphasizes the audience. What is the audience asked to do? And in deliberative, the audience is asked to make a judgment about the future. So these are policy setting debates. These are conversations about what should we do in this situation. One of the classics that he lists is, should we go to war? Or how should we use the money that we have in the coffer? Should we tax? Those are classic deliberative arguments. Judicial arguments are judgments about the past. Judicial is exactly what you think it is, in that these are court cases. These have judges, and we make judgments about actions that were to have taken place. The thing that you won't be familiar with, however, is the notion of the level of suspicion that Aristotle brings to judicial rhetoric. And this is very much a historical situation. So for the Greeks, juries were huge groups of people, hundreds of people in these groups. Therefore, persuasion to them had to have an appeal that could reach a large number of people. Those arguments then, just because of the limitations of a voice and the ability to talk to a large number of people, not get responses and that sort of thing, had to be very simple arguments. And because swaying a crowd by emotion is a lot simpler than through reason, emotion was highly noted. The juries, or where Plato and others got the notion of the mob mentality that they are so worried about with rhetoric. So judicial tends to be fairly stigmatized. Very little is said about epidictic, but Aristotle puts epidictic in here and calls it the kind of speech, or the genre of speech, that takes place in the moment. It's present, and the audience is something he calls theoros, so Theoros. This can be translated as spectator, but the way in which it's a spectator is more the sort of way we're a spectator at a play for Aristotle. That is, that we make a sort of judgment, but it's not really the kind of judgment we make in deliberative. Rather, it's more of an aesthetic appreciation of what's going on, as opposed to a passive thing of sitting back and watching. I've always quite liked that he talks about it in the context of the present, because epidictic oratory often has to do with occasions. On this occasion, we gather to praise or blame, and praise is the more familiar one. So we praise the person who has died, and there's a lot of ritual and ceremony around this work. Again, the things that we tend to praise are the things that the culture values. At one point in the rhetoric, Aristotle says we only praise what we have already deliberated. So he connects deliberative rhetoric and epidictic rhetoric, saying that the things that come out of deliberation, that we should go to war against Iraq, that once that's been deliberated and decided, then we can praise the action. We can say this is a good thing that we did, and we don't have to argue it so much. And that we're much more inclined to use this kind of rhetoric for a particular occasion. So if we have an annual honoring of the dead, those who have died at war, say Memorial Day, we might unquestioningly present survivors of war, soldiers who've been brave and who have represented courage and other values the culture values. We would praise their actions in a particular war. Okay, this has just been a brief overview of 3 times 3. The 3 kinds of knowledge, the 3 proofs, and the 3 genres. And interestingly, each of those 3 has 3 underneath them. I'll go into a lot more detail about logos and the topoi in another lecture. Thank you very much.